Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our SAP Business by Design Q&A Cafe. Thank you for joining us today on this Wednesday, October 7th, 2020. We're here in October already. So today we're doing prepaid accounts payable, and of course, SAP Business by Design with Alex Waddell. He'll be taking you through that. Please join us next week for our Q&A Cafe financial reporting structure in ByDesign. That's on Wednesday, October 14th, same place, same time. We'll see you here. We are recording this session, so everyone will remain on mute for the duration, and you'll be getting a recording about 2 days after this session through the email, as well as that registration link for the next week. So because you'll be silent this whole time, we have our chat window and our questions window. So if you do have any questions, please pop them in there, and Alex will get to them when he can, and I'll help him with that. And that's about it. So I'll hand it over to Alex, and I'll mute myself here.
Great, thanks, Kayla. So welcome everybody. So today we're going to talk a little bit about prepaids and doing them through the accounts payable subledger. And I will just, full transparency right up front, there's quite a few steps to this. So watch with an open mind till you get to the end, because it is a little bit cumbersome. It's something that we've kind of done as a manual workaround, because ByDesign does not really have an automated way to really amortize prepaids directly from a payables transaction. So we actually came up with this solution for VistaView internally, because we ourselves deal with quite a few complicated prepaids, and they're kind of hard to reconcile. So traditionally what would happen is, things would get journalized or posted either through payables or after the fact, reallocated to the prepaid balance sheet account. And then people would set up their monthly reconciliations to book that recurring entry. And maybe we'll just talk on that just briefly. This is probably a process I'm going to assume you're already familiar with. And now as I dive in, just as Kayla mentioned, if you want to have questions as we go, please feel free to drop them in the chat or the questions window. And I will, I'll keep an eye on those and we'll answer them as they come up. So maybe really quickly, I set up a little bit of stuff in advance here. So I just created a standard payables invoice where I in fact coded the invoice. So there's no purchase order in this scenario. I just took the invoice and it was, to a insurance company, but instead of coding it to insurance expense, I've coded it to prepaid expense. It's our annual insurance cost. And so the offset to that, of course, is accounts payable. And then in this particular case, we can set up a recurring journal entry voucher. So once again, this is the regular way to do it. I'll talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons of this way. So there's our first recurring journal entry voucher that I posted today. And if we kind of drill down into that document, here you can see the journal entry, and we can actually go all the way up to the recurring journal entry screen. Once again, you're probably familiar with that. If you're not, that's under general ledger. And from there, you can set up recurring entries. So that's where you set up the job. And this is where you actually set up the job to run it each month. So I'm going to go into the one that I previously set up. And it's sort of when you're setting it up, you'll kind of see a wizard that takes you through each of these tabs. So on your first tab, you really set up the net amount for the year, when you want it to start, when you want it to end. And because I've already done that, the system has kind of shown me, okay, this is what you've proposed. You want me to make 12 entries on the first of each month. If I go to the recurring journal entry voucher screen, this is where I actually set up all of my amounts and rows. So of course you could hit as many cost centers as you want, or make your journal entry as complex as you need to. I just did a very simple one to the finance cost center. So this is where I'm recognizing my expense each month. And then on the next tab, once again, if you're in the build screen, this is where you'll set up the engine to control when you want the entry to post. So once a month, etc. And because I've done this, I already have my 1001. So one kind of cool feature here is you can associate this to a source document. And that source document is the supplier invoice. And the only advantage that kind of gives you is if you go to the balances tab, the system kind of gives you a very rudimentary report. I have multiple sets of books in this report. So maybe what I'll do is just filter this out. And then you kind of have to ignore the totals because they don't really make sense. It's just adding the total debits and the total credits. But on a GL account basis, you can kind of monitor this prepaid and you can see, okay, it's grabbed this $12,000 from that original document that we set up. And so far it's credited out 1,000. So one of 12 months, and it's hit the expense account. And of course, this is just gonna kind of accumulate. And then when you get to your final month, you don't really need to do anything because if you've set up your recurring voucher with an end date, it sort of just closes itself off and your prepaid should be totally cleared out. So once again, that's the traditional method. What we're going to look at today is something a little bit different. We're going to actually use the AP subledger to do this. And so here's where we kind of get into some of the advantages and disadvantages. So in this particular case, I've set up a purchase order and I've done the goods receipt or the service confirmation on that purchase order. And so as you may be aware, it's kind of difficult to hit balance sheet accounts directly when a purchase order is in play. The system really it's expecting people are coding it to maybe a product category or a product itself, or even a GL account. And if you try and put in a prepaid GL account, you may get an error. So, or even if you were to get it to work, you're kind of then putting a lot of pressure on your buyers to understand when things need to hit those accounts. So what we typically see happen is the goods receipt just hits 100% of the expense. So I set up this contract or this PO as a contract for repair and maintenance for a year. And so what's happened is my full annual maintenance is hit in October 1st. 100% hitting the P&L. So we're going to now do a correcting entry and set this up through Payables to reconcile the prepaid. So what I'm going to do is a little bit of back-end setup. I went ahead and started some of this ahead of time because these screens take a few minutes to save, but I'll run you through what I did quickly. So if we go look at our general ledger, I created a new account for this. This is important because I need to create the account type as accounts payable. And this is important only for GL determinations. It's not going to impact your financial reports because you can still put this prepaid on your balance sheet anywhere that you want. Keep in mind, if you create a new GL account, you're going to have to add this to your balance sheet. And then I've set this up to be only automatic postings because I could treat this as effectively as a control account because you're going to see all the transactions come through the subledger. So once I've done that, I go into my account determination groups and I create a group to handle this. And once again, I'm assuming you probably have a fundamental understanding of the GL determinations. We have other Q&A cafes for training on this. So every time we set up a new GL account we want a determination for, we have to create the group. So I've just created a group called prepaid, and I've created that as an accounts payable group for suppliers. And then I'm going to do the last step now, which is to go link that account. So we're going to do that together. So I'm going to go into my account determination group for my accounts payable. And I do see one question here. Can I insert employee on the recurring journal entry voucher? There's no access to like an employee field, but there are like reference description fields and things like that where you could type in an employee name. If I'm not understanding the gist of the question, let me know, Ori. So once I've created my group, I can go in here and I can just add it. So I'm going to add my row for my prepaid. And now I'm going to add my new account. And so there's my account. And so once again, the reason this is appearing is because of that flag that I put into the system on the chart of accounts. And you may not have quite as complicated setup as I have in my little demo environment. So I happen to have multiple sets of books that use different charts of accounts. So it actually is a few extra steps for me. So once you've done that save and linking, don't necessarily need to worry about associating this with your down payment accounts or things like that. We're going to save this, and then the next thing we'll do is we're going to set up our supplier that's going to associate to this new group that we've created. So this is something you do once at the beginning to set it up, and then you can just take advantage of this configuration anytime you have a prepaid. And the same thing really with the supplier as well. So I'm just going to set up a single supplier, but it's up to you if you wanted to do multiple suppliers, you could do that. So you could have a different supplier to represent different types of prepaids, things like that. They could drive to different prepaid GL accounts, or they could all go to the same GL account. So I'm just going to call this prepaids. We'll keep it nice and simple. And I'm going to go to my View All tab. And then this step is important because we don't want this to show up in your accounts payable. This is where, okay, so I'm going to associate it to my company. So for today's experiment, we'll just use, oh, sorry, that's not the one I wanted. And use my Almica Inc. in the US. And now we have access to this prepaid group. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to put a payment block on this. So the reason you're putting a payment block is you don't want this to get selected into any of your payment runs accidentally. Everything is going to drive through to this different GL account. So instead of hitting true payables, it's going to hit your prepaid account. And then one other thing you could do is you could do like an ABC classification for this. So you could set up another classification that's in your configuration screens called prepaids. The ABC classification, I believe, is the one that's available on your aging reports. So that's the other thing. If you're running a payables aging, you don't necessarily want these prepaid transactions kind of muddying your aging reports, but you can run those aging reports and you can filter based on the type of supplier. Okay, so once we have our amount there, sorry, I'm just going to make a note of this amount, my 17,240. And at this point, what we're doing is we're creating something that's a little bit disconnected from the document. So we have a PO, and an advantage to this is we can start setting this up right away, even though the AP invoice has not been received. Because if you're using a three-way match process, you've already recognized the expense at the time you've done the service confirmation. So you don't have to wait until the AP invoice. So here's another advantage over the prior solution I showed you, because in order to associate the AP invoice, it has to exist in the system, right? So I'm going to go up to supplier invoicing, and we're going to do a new credit memo without purchase order. And now I want to select my prepaid, my brand new supplier. And here you're going to want to create an external document reference that ties your transactions together. So maybe this is like a maintenance contract you have, something like that, whatever it is you want to use. Maybe you've got an invoice or something like that. And then depending on whether, like which country you're in, you could decide whether tax is a part of this or not. So this is another advantage of the solution. So for example, if you're in Canada, you would take your input tax credit and you would just set up this prepaid for just the amount, net of tax. In the US, you would amortize the tax. So it's totally up to you. Maintenance. So I'm not going to include tax in my scenario here. And then my GL account here needs to be my maintenance account, which I'm not sure, I think it was this one here. And you would have had a cost center also in play by your purchase order. So you'd want to back that out kind of exactly the same way you've done it here. So if we check this document, that looks okay. So I'm going to post this and we get document 1730. Once again, in my demo environment, I've got an approval engine, so bear with me while I just get this document approved. And while I do this, if you have any questions or comments, observations, feel free to type them into the chat panel. And we'll approve this credit memo. Okay, so that was step one. That seemed like a lot. Keep in mind the setup that I did for the supplier and all that, you would have done that in advance. So really the step that you just saw for the credit memo is really the first step to kind of reverse out the prepaid piece. If we want to understand how that looks, we can go into our general ledger and just have a look at our journal entries. And so now we can see we have a supplier credit memo, and there we have our 17,240. And if we go back down to that supplier invoice, so just, sorry, not the supplier invoice, the external service confirmation. So this is the goods receipt. This is where we, I guess, I don't want to use the word mistaken, but the system booked the entire amount of the P&L. And this is where we're backing it out and establishing it on the balance sheet. So think of that as step one, is really doing this credit memo. And now step two is really setting up the routine with which to amortize that expense over the year. So instead of using the recurring journal entry, we're going to use a recurring payables invoice. So when you go to your work center here for supplier invoicing, go to recurring invoices. If you do not see this on your screen, please feel free to reach out to us. It's a very simple setting to activate this in your system for the recurring invoices. It's pretty much a checkbox behind the scenes, and we don't really have to do any configuration after that. So you may be able to figure that out on your own if you have access, or we'd be happy to help you with that. So when I go to my recurring invoice, I'm also going to keep this on that same supplier. So I'm going to go new recurring invoice. And I'm going to choose my supplier, which is prepaid, my company, and then we'll take our amount. So this one, let's just keep it nice and simple. So it was 17,240, and we're going to divide that by 12, assuming that this was for a year. So 1436, and there's no tax in this one. And so in here, you can put in some sort of comment to tie your things together. So I think I called this maintenance contract 16, something like that. So keep in mind, this is now no longer a credit memo, it's a debit. So it's going to be going as the debit to your account, your expense account. So we'll do our maintenance account again. And whatever cost center, project, cost object you need to link it to, you can do that. If you want this to hit sort of multiple cost centers, you could split this up into multiple rows. If you wanted to spread this expense across multiple cost centers, you've got a lot of flexibility here. Now, when we go to the next screen, we want to give this description. So we'll call this contract 16, annual maintenance. You have the option of whether or not you want this to be confirmed or if you want it to post automatically. That's up to you. You can set this up to happen on specific dates that you hard code in, but probably recurrence pattern works just as well. So choose your end date. So for me, I'll just run this to 09/30/2021. Monthly, every month, and we can do it on a specific day. So why don't I just be consistent? We'll say we'll do it on the 7th day of each month. Totally up to you how you want that to work. So when I hit my next key, you're going to have your 143667, and you'll see that this sort of nets out to what your prepaid was set up. So it's telling you what the events are going to happen every single month. So on the 7th, you can see that posting. That's going to be your expense recognition. Instead of it happening as a recurring journal entry, it's going to happen as a recurring AP invoice. And we're going to hit the next key here. we're going to just, you could attach a document if you want to, so you could attach a copy of that contract or the original invoice. And then if you hit the check button, you can validate there's no errors, and you can save this, and we can release it. And for monitoring our prepaids, so if we go here to recurring invoices and we say all recurring, we can search for the one that we had done. Oops. Prepaids, so there's our monthly amount, 1436. And in here, you can kind of monitor the history to see every invoice that's posted. And then depending on whether or not you said you wanted some sort of, whether you wanted it to post automatically, it would just appear in the system the next day. I can't actually trigger that job here, unfortunately. If you go into your business, sorry, trying to remember now, application user management, there is a job, a background job that's running, and that'll be activated when you activate the feature. So it's the supplier recurring invoice for all buyers. And you can tweak this. It's already set to run every day, probably in the morning or at night. So you could modify the time, but ultimately that's the job that's going to run. Now, what I could do, this logged off on me, so just give me a second to bear back in. I'm going to pop into another system where I have this running. So I'm going to go into my payables subledger. I'm going to go to my supplier accounts, and I'm going to look for my prepaids, and I'm just going to view that account. So in this other environment, I had set this up on a prior day. So the system has already gone ahead and generated my subsequent invoice for my first month. So my prepaid here was 16,065 annual. It's going to book this out. And then what we'll see each month underneath this supplier is an additional document. Now, these things are only associated together through the supplier. So this extra step you would have to do here that you don't have with the recurring journal entry is you can click on the clear manually button. And so once you have your 12 periods have gone by and you should have 13 transactions in the system, you can go onto the clear manually and you can essentially just click each of those 13 transactions. And as long as they net out to 0, of course mine don't because I only have 2 transactions so far, you'll be able to clear them and then they will no longer show as outstanding. So the nice thing about this solution is you've got a real manageable way that you can go in and just sort of manipulate the supplier, clear the transactions against each other, and kind of justify the balance in that account. And you can see here I was kind of sloppy, so I didn't set up, matching document numbers. If you do have a lot of prepaids going through here, you're going to probably want to make sure you have a way to easily match these items together through your document descriptions. So watch for that. Or you could decide to set up multiple prepaid suppliers. Once again, it could all go to the same prepaid account. You don't necessarily need separate accounts, but you have different suppliers for managing them. And then those suppliers, like I said, they don't ever show up to be paid because you put a payment block on them. So they won't mess up your check runs. They can be filtered out of your aging reports. And really, you're just sort of using a portion of your payable subledger to really manage that prepaid section. So when you're going into your, supplier accounts, you could just filter out by those particular prepaid suppliers to kind of get an idea what's in there, knowing that they're not getting mixed in with your accounts payable. So that's quite a lot. There's quite a lot of steps there. Another thing that I want to just mention, because people might be wondering about the item management feature that you have in the system. So where you have the word, like on this credit card clearing account, we have open item management, meaning that when you pass a journal entry to the system, you can include some sort of reference number, and then you can use that reference number to reconcile items together. This particular feature in SAP, while being good in intention, it's got a lot of limitations, which are frustrating. So one of the main limitations is we can't associate that open item number through a subledger entry. So if we're posting the initial entry as, that AP invoice to the prepaid account, I can't establish my reference number. I can only do it through journal entries. So that's a problem. Another problem is you can book entries to this GL account without referencing the open item management. So if people are careless, you end up getting kind of a mess in there, and it becomes sort of hard to clear out those items or know which ones are matching each other. So yeah, like I said, while this was a good intention, I think overall in order to use this, it takes a lot of diligence on the user side to get that to work. Whereas the solution I've just given you, while it's a little bit cumbersome to set up, it's a few steps to think about to establish the prepaid. Once you've done it once, you're kind of set for the year. You don't really have to think about it till you get to the end of the year, and you want to clear out those X number of transactions that have zeroed each other out. So I'm just going to stop there and see if maybe give a moment. Does anybody else have any questions on this process, suggestions, criticisms? I'm open to anything. Like I said, this is something that we just sort of built for ourselves. I am actually hoping to have some conversations internally to see if we could maybe turn this into like a partially automated solution with some sort of custom development. But I don't have a sort of horizon on when that would happen. But we would maybe leverage kind of the same functionality and just apply some automation to kind of trigger those entries. And certainly, if that does get approved and we move ahead with that, I'll let people know. So I don't see any other questions. I'm guessing because it was so clear and easy to understand. But yeah, if there's anything else you think of, feel free to reach out to your representative. As Kayla mentioned, these videos get loaded to our YouTube channel. I believe you're all sent the link. So I'll pass it back to you, Kayla, to wrap us up.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. So yeah, so next week we have our Q&A Cafe for Business by Design and it's called Financial Reporting Structure in, of course, SAP Business by Design. So please join us for that. If you need to register for any of the upcoming sessions, just go to our the resources page and you will find all of them there. So if you don't get this email, then you'll get that there. And have a great rest of your week.